First thing, we were told just now that we are going to have this room, sorry, I'm just trying to get this up and running, through next November. So that's a really good thing, because last time we were across the hall and it was really hot and cramped, and unless something unforeseen comes up that Ivy Tech needs the room for, they said that we are in here now for the next year. So that's really good news. I want to welcome Kelly Carnahan. She is a new member today. Kelly has her own agency.
Yeah.
What's the name of the?
My agency is Bright Design Group. You all might have met my partner, Jim Stowers, who was here last time. And we do work for Bistro.
Okay. Yeah. Do we have any guests or any other new people?
Yeah, we were pleased to have with us Janet Weaver.
Mm-hmm.
Some of you will remember Janet. She's a former member of our club, and it's great to have you back, Janet.
Yeah, welcome. So in December we don't have a speaker, but we are meeting at Crazy Horse, December 10th, 5 to 7. So it'll be a social. We will be providing refreshments. So tell your friends, and hope to see you there. And then we're working on a panel for January, which I'll be able to give you more information about once we have people confirmed. So for today's programme, really sorry about Kerry Thompson. We found out on Thursday that she unexpectedly had to go out of town today, and her whole schedule had to be rearranged, including this. So thank you so much to Zach, and do you go by Mike?
Mike is fine.
Mike is fine, yes. For stepping in at the last minute and agreeing to do this. Just a little bit about each of them. So Mike grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. He attended Michigan State and lived in southeastern Michigan after graduation. As a sports reporter, he's been in Alabama to cover Auburn, Blacksburg to cover Virginia Tech, and then the Cincinnati Bengals before coming to the Herald Times to cover IU. And then Zach has been a sports reporter in Indiana for 20 years, probably, yes. So he's been at the Star since 2013, and focusing on college basketball, football, and then but broader issues like NIL and revenue sharing. Before that, he was with Inside Indiana, which was part of the 24/7 Sports Network, and Inside the Hall. He has a Master's in Sports Journalism from IUPUI, right?
Mm-hmm.
And held numerous positions at the IDS, including editor-in-chief and sports chief for more than one time.
Mm.
So he's been here a long time, and these two know everything there is to know. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
Well, I learned something. I didn't know you had a master's degree.
I do have a master's degree. It was still called IUPUI then. It wasn't IU Indy. Thank you all for coming. I don't know how much prepared sort of discussion we have, other than just.
Still not on, just 'cause.
Oh, yeah. See, you need to use the microphone. Come on.
Well, you're talking.
Get it together. Obviously, it's a very busy time of year. Candidly, a couple years ago by now, we probably would have been slow pedaling our way toward the end of football season. Because so much interest would have shifted toward basketball, but that has obviously reversed course pretty substantially. And, football season is going to go probably through the end of the calendar year at a minimum at this rate. And obviously there's still a lot of interest in basketball. Maybe, we might discuss maybe some shifts, frankly, in that particular sort of fan behavior. In the last few years, but it is a fascinating time both locally and nationally, I think, in college sports, just sort of tracking how much has changed, how much continues to change, and trying to understand the hows and whys, even when sometimes it's changing faster than we can even appreciate it.
Well, I think the sort of modern landscape, you feel it in all three major sports for Indiana in terms of the transformation of the football team with the transfer portal and NIL. The basketball program didn't have a single returning player on the roster from last year, and I think people are sort of adjusting to that. Indiana was a place that took a lot of pride in getting to know their players, and now, it's 13 new guys, and the women's team, 9 players left from last year, and a lot of faces that the cornerstones of Terry Warren's program. So it's a very interesting time, I think, in Bloomington in terms of how it's all, that modern landscape has really kind of transformed all 3 programs, especially this year, and all 3 are trying to kind of navigate. Having, you saw Kurt Signetti do it very successfully when he took over. I think, 40 players, kind of new faces, upwards of that, 30 transfer kids, and how they've sort of built success. And Darren DeVries has done it at his previous 2 stops too, multiple times, where he's had almost nobody come back. So right now you've got coaches kind of facing that modern landscape now.
I guess first, if there are questions, because we could take this in any number of directions, frankly, and I'm happy to do that. But if there are things that are specifically on your mind, whether it's about IU, whether it's about the wider landscape Mike talked about, if anybody's got something, we are happy to field those questions. Otherwise, we'll just podcast basically. Yes, Michael Reschke.
I have a question. Just wondering where you see the future of the conferences going. I remember Jim Fowler did a presentation a few years ago in College of Arts and Sciences continuing education, and it was kind of right before all this. Well, I don't want to say right before, because conferences have been shifting, but where he was, had charge with the, revenue from SEC Network and Big Ten Network, and he was basically like, it's almost only a matter of time before these other ones kind of go away. Where do you see things going? Do you feel like it's like the super conferences that people have mentioned, and more specifically to Indiana and Notre Dame, with them being independent in football but not anything else? So what's your best guess as far as where things are going from here?
Yeah, I think things are going to keep contracting. To what extent, I'm not sure anyone knows. During the sort of like the television boom, there was a race to grow your conference, particularly, number one, to grab, first we were worried about TV markets, and that's why the Big Ten, for example, added Maryland and Rutgers so that it could claim to, when it took the Big Ten network to cable partners and it asked for higher carriage fees, it could claim that Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia through Penn State, New York through Rutgers, you should pay in network basically for the Big Ten network. So the average cable subscriber should pay I think it was $1.40 as opposed to 10 cents or something like that in the Big Ten footprint versus out of it. So the first thing everyone was chasing was TV markets. Then it sort of became brands. But for a long time, the money just kept going up. And if you look, there was a period of 10 to 15 years where all the major conferences, it was almost like you just sort of taxed 6% on the TV, the most recently signed TV deal. You went to ESPN, to Fox, CBS, whoever would give you that number, whatever was close to it. In 2011, the Pac-12 signed the richest TV contract in the country. And by 2015 or 2025, the Pac-12 was gone. So for a long time, the money just kept going up. And so obviously there were conferences that were getting poached from, and the Big East got downsized and things like that. But some of that's not new. In the 70s, USC and UCLA went to the rest of the Pac-8 and said, you're going to admit Arizona and Arizona State or we're going to leave. And the reason they did that was because the road team got a 20% cut of ticket sales. And Arizona and Arizona State were in the process of building stadiums that were much larger than any of the other Pac-8 schools. And so, this has been going on in a quest for more revenue, for more power, for more control and influence for as long as college sports have existed. The difference in the last few years is that while costs have continued to rise, both directly through things like revenue sharing and indirectly through the need to, sort of redirect fundraising dollars to things like NIL, in addition to obviously coaches' salaries and whatever else, the TV money that kind of fueled that boom has really started to level off because of cord cutting, because of streaming. And so what happened, for example, to the Pac-12 in this case, technically the Pac-12 still exists, but it's just 2 schools, plus it's about to be a bunch of Mountain West schools, was the Big Ten wanting 2 big brands to improve its position for its next TV deal, recognizing that the pie of money wasn't going to keep expanding and that therefore it was going to have to be more appealing to take a larger share of someone else's, went and got USC and UCLA. In response, the Pac-12 bet on the idea that Apple TV would come in and pay essentially the going rate for what was left of the Pac-12. And Apple TV didn't, because streaming services just have not shown like the financial interest in fueling or I guess funding television contracts at nearly the same rate that what we would expect from ESPN, from Fox, et cetera. And Oregon and Washington, when they saw how low the Apple TV number was, they went to the Big Ten and they said, we will gladly take a lower share than everyone else. We just want to be in a conference that we think has a better financial future. So the next time these TV deals get renegotiated, we want to be in the conference that's in a much safer position. Once they left, the Pac-12 just collapsed, and it was kind of a free-for-all. I don't know if we're going to get to like a true Super League type conference, but I think that we're probably going to see another realignment sort of like that.
But it also depends, I think what you're seeing, the reluctance, because, I mean, there could have been a chance the ACC could have broken up in the last couple of years, you know, if the SEC or Big Ten got aggressive, but what is the value added?
Yeah.
You know, there was, the West Coast was a real lure for the Big Ten, because that was, you talk about markets, they weren't there. But now, what do you get by adding, you know, 2 teams like Virginia and North Carolina? What does that add to your conference? How much more money can you extract out of those TV deals?
Because you're going to have to start, everyone else's share is going to go down if you add more schools. So you have to justify
It dilutes
those
the
additions.
things, and then there's also the kind of like your schedules. You know, people already complain kind of about parity and how do you play a basketball schedule? How do you play everybody? And it adds other problems. And is that enough to, you know, when you're not making more money from adding these teams, I think you run into that. And I think that's why we've seen the SEC and Big Ten not pounce on the ACC, because they were vulnerable. I mean, Florida State and you know, Clemson really wanted out, or at least wanted to. You know, they wanted the SEC to say, you know, welcome us with open arms, but you know, they were like, they weren't biting, and so that's why you kind of saw that kind of get resolved. But I think that's kind of the question is how much can you get from any of these new teams, what they add, like Oregon, UCLA, USC. You know, there was a real benefit to having the West Coast, I think, as your imprint for the Big Ten. But I don't think any of the schools out there, you know, what's the attraction there?
And like 15 years ago, when the TV money was just kind of ever expanding and everyone was starting their own network and we were seeing so much more push to streaming, you also wanted bigger conferences because you just wanted more inventory. You wanted more games because the more games you could put on the Big Ten Network, the more advertising you could sell, the more money you were going to make. Now that the TV money has sort of leveled off, we're starting to reach like the top of the bell curve. People are going back to, as Mike said, asking more about quality inventory. And you know, how often are you hearing complaints now about, well, there are just no good games in the Big Ten this weekend, and it's because there are so many teams that the schedules are diluted, and that's why people wonder if we are going to see some kind of sort of continued sort of consolidation to try and get the bigger schools playing one another more often, but then that might leave, you know, a Purdue or an Indiana or someone that, you know, whoever the stakeholders are that are making the decision might look at and say, how much value do they really add? Is it worth keeping them kind of in the room, essentially?
And to bring it back to Indiana, the investment in football is part of where that comes from, right? Like, Indiana's a basketball, you know, heavily basketball drive the conversation in Indiana, but what drives the money in college sports is football. And what gets you a seat at the table in college sports is football. And so if you don't have a football program that's at that level, I'm not saying Ohio State, but if you're not bringing something and you're not...
If people aren't watching you on TV,
yeah,
essentially.
And you're not pouring money into your program and trying to make a point that we are serious about this, you'd be, I think, at risk of being in that contraction if they went to that. Like, you know, you could say, yeah, basketball, but that basketball does not drive conversation nationally the way football does. And I think you've seen sort of how transformative their success in football has been. But I think what drives that is when those conversations happens, if that's the way things go in the Big Ten or the SEC, and they're looking, man, do we cut 2 teams, or man, do we kind of change the makeup of things? The teams that don't have those football programs are probably the ones that do get left behind. And I think that drove a lot of the investment with, Pat Winton, Scott Dolson, when they had those conversations, like, we need to have a football program, we need to have a winner, and that's obviously kind of what happened.
And the suspicion is that between 2030 and 36, the ACC, Big Ten, Big 12, and SEC TV deals will all expire. So will the current NCAA tournament. Now, that's been extended a couple of times, but I don't think it will be again for this reason. There is the suspicion or belief is that it will be somewhere in that reshuffling of the deck financially. I mean, like Big Ten's 2030, I think the tournament, either the tournament's 31 and the Big 12 is 32, or vice versa. The SEC's 34 and I think the ACC's 36. It will be somewhere in that sort of reshuffling that if there is another big wave of break apart and pull back together and consolidate and shrink, it will happen there. And there are people who think it will be a true super league, that like the 24 biggest brands will just tear off and go do their own thing. There are people I've talked to who just don't think there's enough money for that anymore, like to justify tearing down all the other institutions. That there's just not, we may have missed kind of the boat on there being the right amount of TV money to make it worth it for those schools, but nobody's really sure exactly what it'll look like, other than that everyone kind of thinks that's probably the next sort of big, sort of shifting point in college sports. Jim.
Zach and Michael, I got a electronic message recently that appeared to be from Scott Dolson, and it was talking about a planned renovation of Memorial Stadium. They said the last renovation dealt primarily with the athletes and training rooms and so forth, facilities. The next renovation is going to have to do with creature comforts for the fans primarily, if I read the thing correctly. When I went back to look at it, it was gone, and Zippo. So I wondered if that was sent out unintentionally, prematurely or something by the athletic department. But my question really is about Memorial Stadium. And I saw the last game, Wisconsin, we drew 55,000. Good number for us, but then you look at the Big House in Ann Arbor, 111,000. You look at Penn State, 100+ thousand in Ohio State. How important is it to IU going forward to increase the seating capacity? And do we have enough fans in Indiana? How many seats are enough, and how many are too many? And how important is it to the future, given the overall dynamics of television revenue versus ticket sale revenue?
Well, a lot there. So facilities was like an arms race at one point in college sports. But then NIL came, and it's taking a back seat, because you're seeing all these departments have to fundraise for all these different buckets, right? You got NIL, now you got revenue sharing, and now you got facilities, you got coaches' contracts, and so something has to give, right? And so I think there was kind of in 2023 is kind of when they sent out the survey to fans for what they wanted from Memorial Stadium. That sort of was like the kind of initial, like, what do we do here? And then things kind of slowed because, like, they've had to raise a lot of funds in other areas. And I think the area where you've seen a lot of schools kind of pull back is the facilities, and try to be careful, because when you overcommit and you take on debt and things like that, you can get really in trouble. UCLA is an example of that, where you're just departments where you're in the red and can really cause problems. And so they've been very deliberate about that. Scott's kind of talked about kind of throughout this, trying to develop like a master plan and master vision, not just for a short-term stuff, like how do we take Memorial Stadium into the future? I don't know necessarily that it's making seating capacity like a huge increase in that. I think it's more modernizing the stadium. I think that Kurt Cignetti's they've had conversations about what he would like to see kind of them do at the stadium. He's talked about at the Big Ten Media Days, ripping down the press box side and those suites and renovating that. I think that's probably kind of, I don't know, maybe the biggest focal point, because that is a very outdated, the suites and things, and that's where you kind of make some of those premium money. You've seen Indiana, make small steps. They've added premium seating area and basically anywhere they can fit in the stadium the last couple of years. They modernized kind of the food service. They've tried to improve that. They've tried to do small things along the way as they've kind of in the background been working to raise funds and develop sort of like this very specific, like, I think he said 10-year plan for Memorial Stadium and what that looks like. And I think why it's kind of been a slower than probably fans hoped for is because of the idea that, you know, revenue sharing alone, they're having to commit $20 million a year, and it's going to go up every year. And then the NIL of it, where they're kind of waiting to see what happens and how much they need to put there for fundraising. And so it's still
I think
going on.
I think you're still probably looking at, I would guess, 12 to 15 million a year for NIL fundraising, and you're not necessarily spending like all of that. You don't spend down to zero in your NIL, and then that's some of that'll be cash on hand. But you're probably, I would say, looking at least 10 to 12, maybe 15 million.
So I mean, that's all money that could have gone to stadium improvements before, you know, or gone to a bigger project to get it off the ground quickly. So that's why it's kind of slowed down. What his exact vision is, he's kind of been shy to sort of commit because I think they are still formalizing those plans. But I mean, this goes back even farther than me. I mean, they've talked about this for a long time in terms of like because I mean, they did the end zones. I mean, you can speak to kind of the history of what they've done. They modernized the weight room that's in there and the offices and things like that. But they do want to take on a bigger project, and what that looks like, I think, remains to be seen.
I do think there is like philosophically, and I'm not endorsing one side of this argument or the other, but the big reason that arms race happened, I think everyone can be honest now, is because college athletics departments wanted to be able to say with a straight face, we don't have excess money to pay our athletes. So for the 15 to 20 year period where revenues were increasing by 10, 20, 30% sometimes per year. Indiana was making about $35 million a year in athletics revenue in 2006. By 2019, Indiana was near $130 million. That is how rapidly the line grew. And through that time, there was still this argument on the collegiate side. Their athletes are amateurs. We don't have the money to pay them. And there was essentially an unspoken need to find a place to spend that money so that at the end of the year, there was no budget surplus. There was no, well, wait a minute, you say you can't, but you made $25 million a year or more than you spent. If you think about a large-scale project Penn State's renovation of Beaver Stadium, I think it's something like $700 million plus. And basically, I think what they're doing, and it's over several years, but what they're essentially doing is just tearing down each corner of the stadium and just like tearing one down, rebuilding it, tearing the next one down, rebuilding it. If you think about how a place like Indiana would have funded that, it would have been through debt service of $20 million a year for 20 years, which would be a $400 million project, which would probably cross off the list all of what you needed to do. Where we're at now, and I think I suspect this is going to start becoming more of a conversation in college sports in the next, 10 years. There are a lot of facilities, even as we talk about arms race, a lot of that was we're going to build a practice facility for football or basketball, or we're going to rebuild our baseball softball complex or something like that. People weren't building brand new football stadiums, and a lot of them weren't building brand new basketball arenas either. There are a lot of colleges around the country that have these buildings that are starting to really show their age, but there is no practical means for publicly funding them. There is no argument for example, publicly funding a new $350 million football stadium in Bloomington, Indiana. The tax dollars would go to that when ultimately, you're not going to get concerts. You're not going to get sort of the alternate revenue that is going to make that a worthwhile investment. So what you're going to have to do is renovate what you have. Indiana obviously moved on that with Assembly Hall, and it seems like, generally speaking, probably put a number of years of life back into that building. Now they got to do it with Memorial Stadium. They're not going to be alone, but it is going to be something that I think, to Mike's point, is going to be, it's a process that's going to take longer. It's going to have to be, I think, more deliberate. I think you're going to be, whereas you might see, a project like this take 18 months, or 2 years, a decade ago. I think maybe now it's like a 5 to 7 year plan in terms of, this year will be about rebuilding the press box. Next year will be about gutting, all of the plumbing and bathrooms and all of those things. But it will all have to happen a little bit more slowly, because the flip side is, and to your point about, the value of game day revenue, which is still a significant piece of the pie, and if TV money does start going down, is going to become even more important. You can't close the stadium either, and it's not practical to say, well, let's just see if the Colts will let us play in Lucas Oil for a year. That's just not. I know the Bears did that with Illinois Stadium years ago, but that is not something that is going to work for every college every time they need to do something like this. And so I do think that is actually kind of going to become, I suspect, something that we are talking more about in the next like 10 to 12 years, because this is going to be, there have been places like Michigan and Ohio State that have had the money all along the way to continuously put into their stadiums, but there have been a lot of places like Indiana that would have looked at something like that as an item too costly to worry about. Or they would have looked at it like Indiana did and said, we have all of these other capital needs. Once the money started coming in, we have all of these other capital needs we have to address first. But now you are left with these, 9-figure renovation concerns for stadiums that I think are going to start showing their age. But again, that you can't necessarily make a compelling sort of public utility argument for just tearing it down and completely replacing it. It's the same reason why Assembly Hall is not going anywhere, is because replacing Assembly Hall with something, up to the expectation of a place like this would just cost too much money. So
it seems like it's a lot more complicated now to be an athlete in the Big Ten than it was some years ago. So we're talking about money and TV and facilities, but what's the impact on the athletes of all these changes? And even adding on that extra travel, now you might be on to the West Coast, you might be on to the East Coast, but just that whole complicated setup they now have to deal with.
Well, they get paid now, so they're feeling pretty good about it, I think, is ultimately the bottom line too, part of it. The travel thing, it's probably harder on the sort of secondary sports, but like the football team, charters flights, they're not flying commercial to these different places and having to catch a flight. So they make these things as comfortable as possible for the athletes. I think the tricky part for modern athletes that they didn't have, obviously, 10, 20, 30 years ago, is social media and all the kind of the negative parts of that come with it, of being in the spotlight. You hear athletes and trying to navigate that. But yeah, no, I don't hear many complaints in terms of what they're being asked to do, because they are getting paid now, right? And frankly, a lot of money, especially on the football and basketball side of it. What?
My question is, how much are athletes being paid?
Well, it's
what's the range? Who gets how much?
Yeah.
And where's the money come from? I feel like I should know that, but I don't.
The revenue sharing specifically is they've kind of raised the money in different ways, and they've tried to, they obviously made some cuts and shifted things around in the last 2 years, kind of preparing for it. We don't have like exact dollar figures a lot. You don't get them very much. A couple football players have talked about it. Mike Niziolek, who is now kind of a media personality, said he made $400,000 last year. Lewis Moore, who was in a court case to try to get eligibility, had to reveal that if he didn't gain eligibility this fall, he would have been out. I think it was $400,000 as well, or $300,000. And he's sort of a starting safety on the team. And so, given those two amounts, you can probably say that your average starter, your kind of baseline, that's probably the baseline for the football team. And a guy like Fernando Mendoza is probably making a lot more than that as quarterback. Kurt Cignetti said he's, a lot of these teams have gone to sort of or tried to integrate like an NFL model, like a GM that does like all the salaries and things like that of these players, and tried to balance the roster. He does it kind of himself, and he says it's pretty easy. The best players get the most, and you kind of go from there. And so I think your starting point for football at least is around $400,000 for a starter for this team.
So,
A year.
yeah. So to your one thing I would add, and to your question first, sports gambling is going to be a really big problem here.
Tied into social
You
media.
tie it into social media and the idea that people can bet on college sports. I mean, sports in general and whatever. I'm not condemning gambling, but like that people can bet on college sports and then, as and when they lose money, have such direct access to direct their anger in the form of abuse at those athletes. And that is, I mean, we are only, I think, beginning to sort of scratch the surface of the concerns over like mental and emotional well-being that's going to affect athletes.
The Indiana basketball players last year talked about how that did take a toll.
Yeah.
Not gambling related, but in terms of it got pretty ugly there at the end of Mike Woodson's tenure, and a lot of the fans took it out on some of the players. And at the end of the year, they said it was that dragged them down a little bit. That It was hard to hear go on social media. If they went on social media, they were not hearing nice things. And so at the end of the year, they were like, it was trying. But obviously, those are unique circumstances. But that did.
That's the concern with gambling is that's not a
same
unique
thing.
circumstance. Like someone is going to bet on you and lose like all the every day, and that person is not a fan. They're like theirs is not an emotional response tied to a desire to see you succeed. Theirs is wholly selfish. It is you lost me money, and so I'm going to be angry with you, and I'm going to express that to you. And so there's not really a rational conversation to have. I mean, there's a rational conversation to have with a fan and say, like, hey, don't you think this is too far? There's not really a rational conversation to have with someone who thinks that condones, that kind of behavior. Steve, I mean, to your question, like the highest paid players are, I mean, like I think the going rate for a top end quarterback probably is about $2 million right now in college football. On the other hand, obviously, in non-revenue sports, like in non-revenue sports, like the average athlete's probably only getting $1,000, maybe a couple thousand. There is
increased scholarship.
They can. So this is kind of like the next thing that may happen around the rev share is they gave you the option to split off 2.5 of the $20.5 million revenue sharing cap and spend it on additional scholarships if you wanted, rather than on money. The idea being, at the end of the day, if you're paying for more of an athlete's tuition than you were before, that is effectively giving them that's not dissimilar to just paying them a salary. There is a push, and I guess I would probably call it a growing push, to allow athletics departments, if they so choose, because you don't have to fully fund the revenue sharing cap, and a lot of schools aren't, especially outside the power, what we call the Power Four conferences. A lot of schools aren't going all the way to $20.5 million. But there's a growing push to allow schools to add a certain amount of scholarships above what they already can provide, but independent of revenue sharing. And the idea would essentially be your revenue sharing budget would go almost exclusively to revenue generating sports, football, men's basketball, women's basketball, maybe in certain places, volleyball or baseball. And then you would probably also have a small amount set aside for, like, what did Mike Babinski call it at Purdue? Highly recruitable athletes. So like Lily King would be a good example at Indiana, or a really, really good, men's soccer player or something that was, sort of a specific case. But otherwise, what I think people would like to do is be able to, instead of pushing revenue sharing to non-revenue sports, just be able to provide more scholarships in those sports, and just sort of say, where the number, I think in soccer, for example, is 9.9. If you want, you can go. Now you have to find the money to do it, obviously, and that's the great challenge in all this. But if you want, you can just say, well, we're going to go up to 20. At Indiana, men's soccer is correct. Well, the number of total scholarships. So baseball is the example I always use. Sports that are not fully scholarship, like people aren't on full scholarship, they're called equivalency sports. You're given the equivalent of a certain number of scholarships. In baseball, it's 11.7. And you can have a roster of, I think it's 34 or 35 is the number now, and you can split that 11.7 however you want. So if you talk to a baseball roster, a lot of guys will be on like 10% of a scholarship. And then if they can get in-state tuition, then that's great for them. Or if there's some other scholarship that they can add on top of that but like very few baseball players, very few IU soccer players are on full scholarships. What I think a lot of athletic directors would like to do is be able to say, well, at our school, these are the sports that are culturally important to us that maybe don't make money. So here it would be like, men's soccer, men's and women's swimming and diving, more recently maybe baseball. We would like to be able to just commit more scholarship dollars to those sports, but not have that money come out of the revenue sharing budget. So the revenue sharing budget can just be reserved exclusively for directly paying athletes the way you would pay professional athletes. But we will also then provide more opportunities for either more of the players in these equivalency sports, non-revenue equivalency sports, to be on scholarship, or the ones on scholarship to get more of their annual education paid for. And I think that will happen, but I don't know for certain. Yeah.
I'm a long-time fan, but who decides on different sports when it's going to be broadcast? There's so much going on now. It used to be I could watch a few of the IU games at the Big Ten Network. Now they're all over the place, and it's just this way with every sport: football, basketball, women's sport. Who decides? Who makes those decisions? What it's going to be broadcast?
Well, so with the Big Ten specifically, it's a little bit easier for the SEC because the SEC's sole TV partner for all of its major sports is ESPN ABC, and like the SEC network is owned by ESPN ABC, so like everything funnels through one company. And it will be made essentially by, some combination of like executives, programming directors. The schools will have some say. There will be certain parameters a conference will put on things. There are rules about NCAA rules about, like, for example, travel and how long athletes how much class they're allowed to miss, and therefore, this can only be like a baseball game has to start at a certain time on a Sunday because there's a cutoff because they have to be home. The Big Ten, it's a little bit more complicated because the Big Ten has 3 different TV partners. That's how they got to the number that they liked, basically. With the big sports, there is essentially a draft. And different, like Fox tends, because Fox is putting the largest share of money in, and Fox also owns a majority share of the Big Ten Network. Fox tends to get precedent, not always, not like every week, essentially.
Well, there's horse trading too.
Yeah, there's like they'll say like
they want a game down the line in the schedule. We'll trade you, give you this pick this week to get that game to try to balance out the schedules. It's very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, like and then you have considerations like to your point, since the Big Ten brought NBC on board, now the NBC really wants to push people to its streaming service, Peacock. So now there's more and more basketball and some football being pushed to Peacock. I mean, it is, it's one of those things where, on the one hand, I understand anyone who's frustrated with it. Like, it's hard for me to keep track of, a lot of the time, and it's my job, basically. On the other hand, it is what is paying for all these things that that ultimately, like, the example I use is I'm a big soccer fan, and I remember listening to someone talking about when the team that I support put an advertising partner on their jersey sleeve, and they said that looked terrible, and then I found out how much money they were getting for it annually, and suddenly I wasn't so bothered by it anymore. Like, that is the difficult sort of balance that everyone's trying to strike here, because if you just continue to corporatize everything, you will start to alienate your consumers, and if you do that, you'll make less money. But, like, to Mike's point, like, there is this constant sort of, like, back and forth and counterbalance of how do we make sure that everyone is satisfied enough that we keep getting paid, but how do we present the best product to fans, whether it's in this the stadium or on television. How do we scatter? Again, like it's a lot easier in the SEC because the SEC has one TV partner, so everything is at least streamlined through one, sort of like one apparatus. But even there, I think SEC fans would have a lot of the same complaints about, well, where am I supposed to find, baseball's a really big deal down in the South. Like, where am I supposed to find Mississippi State LSU? Is it on ESPN Plus? Is it on ESPN2? Is it on the SEC network? Like, who do I need to pay to have this one versus that one? Like, it's, yeah.
Does Big Ten Plus have all the replays eventually?
I don't remember, honestly.
Because they have a streaming service you could subscribe to through the Big Ten that gets you, I think, all the secondary sports and I think the replays of the game. So you could, if you miss it the first time, they house it on there for all the different schools. I'm not sure if it's every game or just every game that they air. So that is sort of a central way to sort of make sure you don't miss anything, that they have that. But
Yeah.
I don't know how extensive it is, if it's only things that they air, which they air a lot of the secondary sports beyond basketball and women's basketball. But that's one way to maybe try to kind of keep up with it if you miss some stuff.
And kind of feel bad asking another question about money, but here we are. And the private equity and the story involving with the Big Ten, and obviously there's been understandable pushback on that from the schools such as like Michigan, as well as elsewhere. Is it inevitable that the number is just going to be so big that they're going to make an offer they can't refuse? Because the numbers in private equity elsewhere in other areas of the world, that number is insane. When it comes to that amount of money, is it only amount of time before a conference just can't turn it down?
I mean, I think you've seen conferences, not just the Big Ten, flirt with it.
Yeah.
They seem to.
It's only a matter of time before somebody
does
at
it.
least.
I don't know if
Yeah.
it's the Big Ten, but they've run into the same problems that the Big Ten did, right? The perception of it, at the university level, I don't think there's as much of a stomach for it as the athletic level, like the board of trustees, these university presidents. I think trying to sell that to the public is kind of the part that they're trying to have a hard time digesting. And we've seen kind of the pushback at Michigan and USC, specifically in the Big Ten's case. Is it inevitable somewhere? Yes. Is it inevitable in the Big Ten? I don't know.
I think so. Like just this week, so the Big Ten is eager to call it a private capital deal. That they claim they're not taking on debt. Now we can have a semantic conversation about whether or not, immediate cash infusion for an exchange of dividends later is debt. But the deal they worked out is with the University of California pension system, essentially. And this week, the investment arm of that system, it's called UC Investments, or UC Investments, yeah, came out and basically said, we think we should halt this deal until it's clear that everyone in the Big Ten supports it.
Yeah, Michigan's been very vocal about.
Yes, and that's like there's some of that is like Michigan doesn't need the money. There is some of that also is a bit of like a political beef between Michigan and the Big Ten, because Tony Petitti didn't really stand behind Michigan through the whole sign stealing thing with Jim Harbaugh and Connor Stallions. Like this is why college sports is stupid and we love it. Like there is a part of it that's just dumb and therefore very entertaining. Southern Cal's objection seems to be that they're not getting as much money as Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. Like Mike said, it will happen somewhere eventually. I think the Big Ten
individual programs have even talked about it or flirted with it.
Yeah, the Big Ten's argument is like this is a responsible partner. The deal as it's been presented requires UC Investments to stay in for at least 15 years. So it can't be like what you see with a lot of private equity deals where they flip their position within just a few years. I mean, it's still fair to be very skeptical of it. Will it happen in the Big Ten? Yeah, I don't know the answer. Will it happen somewhere? I would be shocked, because at the end of the day, there is an element of you can hold some of these athletics directors, coaches, university administrators to account for not foreseeing the coming costs of player compensation, of athlete compensation. They probably got about a 10-year runway on that and just absolutely did not try to land the plane at all. But to torture that metaphor through to its conclusion, there is kind of an element of, do you want to argue over who broke the plane, or do you want to try and fix it, essentially? And like the there are going to be some like very real financial challenges in the not very distant future at some of these universities. Now, again, we can have a philosophical conversation about, well, then why are you paying a football coach $12 million a year? Like, I understand that, but it's college athletics has never been a wholly rational financial. And listen, if you want to be really cold about it in the other direction, if you want college athletics to behave like a business, then they would play two sports. Like that is the difficult and sort of intersection of money and college sports, is that when you don't want it to behave like a business, that is understandable. But when you say, well, why aren't you being more fiscally responsible? There are two sports that make money and they pay for everything else. That would not be a fiscally responsible way to run a business. So it is but again, like since we started charging money for tickets, like this tension has existed. It's just, these are the problems of our time, and so we're trying to figure them out. Like, yeah, Jen? Yeah.
Yeah, switch gears a little bit. When Coach DeVries came in, he wanted to have his own team. Apparently he didn't want to keep any of the guys from last year. Anthony Leal and Noah Top both appealed for another year. Now, it took the NCAA headquarters, who was making decisions, probably almost 2 months to make a decision that could be made in a week, not a day. So what I'd like to know is what your comments are on this, and how you assess the effectiveness and competency of the NCAA headquarters.
The eligibility thing has been a big problem. And like if athletes have the appetite to file a lawsuit, that's probably the best case way to fight this. You've seen it, Lewis Moore, I mentioned earlier, he was a junior college player, and the NCAA had decided they faced a court case in December that they lost, and said junior college players can play this year, this 2025-26. Then 2 months later they said, well, most junior college players can play. We changed our mind and they changed the rules. And then that left this couple dozen players that basically filed lawsuits around the country to try, and there were different results in a lot of them. Some got eligibility, some didn't. And so you've kind of seen junior college players trying to change that so that those things don't count. You've seen a lot of different things, and the reason the NCAA is kind of struggling is because they're facing these lawsuits, like all the rules they can't, these court cases that they've lost, all the revenue sharing and things has set up the system. How do you word that? Like the rules have no teeth, basically.
Yeah,
So,
essentially.
And
like what's happened like procedurally, to your point about like why it would take so long for Luke Goody or Anthony Leal to get an answer, is because everyone generally, whether we agree with them or not, everyone generally accepted like the vast majority of eligibility rules kind of in perpetuity until recently. And so very few athletes would ever actually appeal for, I think I deserve an extra year because of a medical concern or a family hardship or something like that. And so that process wouldn't take very long because it was a very small, just physical pool of athletes that were asking for it.
The process still took long.
Well, that's true, but this summer it was just a log jam of so many athletes asking for years, extra years by effectively challenging existing eligibility rules and requirements, that it was taking everyone longer than what history had said was the case. The waiver system that we're talking about has never made sense, right? No.
Because they file initial request, the NCAA issues a ruling, doesn't really explain why, then you appeal it, and these things take months. You have to go through your conference first. Yeah.
And if you clearly satisfied one of the rules to get a waiver, the conference would approve it. If they didn't, the conference would reject it, and then you'd have to go to the NCAA.
Yeah,
and so it just
the process was never ending.
Yeah.
Well, also, Coach DeVries kind of made it known that he wanted to get his own group, so he even accepted them back.
He did. So Anthony Leal, Luke Goody's argument for an extra year was always more compelling than Leal's, just because of the nature of their cases and what they were sort of arguing for. Indiana did leave a spot open for Goody, and I mean, the expectation was that he probably would get rejected, but if he wanted, I think our understanding at the time was that Indiana was prepared to support him, like legally challenging that ruling if he was told no. And once he got to the end of it, he just said, "I think I'm ready to just move on." And it gets really like messy and complicated too, because a lot of the fundamental challenges to these eligibility rules are built around a very modern concept, which is player compensation and the ability for athletes to say, I am being denied the right to earn a fair wage by these arbitrary eligibility rules. Like in Luke Goody's case, the issue was that he had played too many games in a season where he'd missed most of the year through injury, but he'd played them at the end of a season rather than the beginning of a season.
And
so
you play postseason games, which you can't do to maintain.
Yeah. So like it was sort of on the athlete side, it was this argument of, well, that's a fairly arbitrary. Like why do these games in November matter different to these games in March? And now there's I have no idea what Luke Goody made in NIL last year, but let's just say it was $500,000. He could say the NCAA, this seemingly arbitrary eligibility rule is preventing me from making another $500,000 next year. That is an illegal restriction of free trade, essentially. And so it's very messy. To your question about the NCAA's enforcement teeth, they are worn down to the nub.
And eventually, what they want to try to do, and there's not even agreement on this, is like, they used to have red shirts where you could sit out a year and then not count. But they want to kind of do away with all this and say just you have 5 years basically, and not have to worry about this. But that's not kind of gone through yet.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen
this year,
like this time around anyway.
One very last question,
Mm-hmm.
as we are at 1 o'clock.
Did you learn anything doing the Fernando Mendoza presser this morning?
What did he say? What was his quote that I told you? If you had an answer, I'll pull up his one quote that I had. You can go first.
Well, am I allowed to? I mean, I guess I got to sit down with him separately for something I'm writing. I don't know. I mean, it is.
No, this was the quote. The future is a whole string of nouns.
Yes, he used that in our sit down too. It was I liked yesterday. I liked yesterday on Pat McAfee where he studies quarterbacks past, present, and future. Yeah. If he can see into the future, he should probably win the Heisman Trophy. I mean, I just like I find honestly like their story as a family really compelling. Like they're like I think like he is Fernando Mendoza the fifth. Both of his parents' families are of like deep Cuban descent. His dad played high school football with Mario Cristobal at the same high school where they played high school. Mario Cristobal is the head coach at the University of Miami. Like they lived, his dad's a doctor. They lived in a perfectly like normal house in suburban Miami, but his parents, their parents, because his brother Alberto's on the team too, obviously, their parents had them share a room growing up because they wanted there to be that like tight-knit brotherly relationship. And I mean, it is kind of like in a way, it is a very modern college athletic story that like two brothers who I think played together for maybe 1 year in high school, maybe two, would take completely separate sort of career paths in college and still be able to come back together and, play together. And I think the stat ran around that they were the first set of brothers since the Allens at Arkansas in 2015 to throw touchdown passes in the same game and all those different kinds of things. I mean, it's an interesting and it's a fun story to tell, and obviously I think it's only going to keep getting more sort of intensely covered. So.
Well, this was fantastic. Thank you again for being here at late notice. And it was just, I feel like we scratched the surface, and I have a million more questions. So thanks again, and on the board. Could board members just have a quick huddle before we break up?